Hello and welcome to Prairie Pulse. Coming up a little bit later in the show, we'll learn about Scandinavian folk art from Grand Forks painter Pieper Bloomquist. But first, joining me now is our very own Mike Olson, host of Into the Music. Mike, thanks for joining us today.
Oh, happy to be here.
Well, as we get started, Mike, tell the folks a little bit about yourself and your background.
Well, I was born in Minot, North Dakota. We never actually lived in Minot. We lived in Carpio. My dad was helping my grandfather farm that summer. And I actually, first 3 months of my life were in a gas station garage that was converted for the family to live there. And worked out, I guess. We later moved to Minneapolis and followed my dad in his career. He was in medical school and then joined the public health service. And so then we moved to San Francisco and to New Orleans and eventually to Bismarck and then finally to Williston.
Okay.
And I went to high school in Williston and then spent several years I lived in Fargo for a time, got married and lived out in Spokane, Washington for a number of years, and then returned to North Dakota, worked in the oil fields in the 80s, and then eventually went to Grand Forks and started my radio career in Grand Forks at UND on a station called KFJM.
Well, absolutely. And of course, Prairie Public got into partnership with UND, and history is now you're working with Prairie Public and still doing things with KFJM. Tell us about your show, Into the Music. What is it, and sort of what goes into producing it?
Into the Music is an eclectic music show that draws from different elements of primarily American music, that whether it's roots rock or blues, zydeco, bluegrass, jazz, elements of all of these that are woven together into a show that presents all this new music and different music in a way that people seem to like.
Well, and you say eclectic because I listen to your show especially when I'm in the car traveling, and you hear a wide variety of music. Why is that?
Well, I mean, it's a reflection of my own taste in a way, but it's also a reflection of the kind of music that a public radio station brings in, and that we are able to play for others. We have, it's commonplace now for stations to have jazz programming and folk programming and bluegrass programming and things like that. And this is all put together in the mix with modern, I would say, I guess pop artists, indie rock, things like that reflect all these different streams of music in what they do as well.
Well, I know you use the term, and we have here, how do you define it? Roots, rock and jazz, or AAA music? I mean, how do you really, is there a good definition?
Well, the definition was always the problem for this. But I really appreciated it. Marie actually came up with the roots, rock, and jazz umbrella, and I like that because that works for me because those elements are all in the mix. When I started Into the Music, that was actually before there was a designation of AAA. Mm-hmm. I started it in 1991, and that was prior to a national show like the World Cafe that NPR put together. But you could see out there, prior to that, public radio had often been considered classical music and news. And yet I was an avid listener, and I knew many people that avidly listened to public broadcasting, but that listened to other music. And oftentimes the music by these other artists, whether it was Paul Simon or David Byrne or Van Morrison or Bob Dylan or many others, the records were reviewed on Morning Edition or All Things Considered or Fresh Air or shows like that, and the artists would be brought in and interviewed, but the music wasn't reflected anywhere on the airwaves. And so I said, presented this idea of creating a program that would incorporate artists like Paul Simon at the time had Graceland out. There were artists like David Byrne and the Talking Heads and Sean Colvin. That the records were produced in a way that were there were higher production values than some of the folk records that had come out prior to that. So they sounded good together on the radio, but it really hadn't been done before.
Mm. You also host the Blues Cruise.
I do.
What is that?
The Saturday Evening Blues Cruise is a survey of oftentimes the new recordings that come out each year. I love old blues and have spent many years listening to blues prior to the 1940s, from the 20s and 30s. But the Saturday Evening Blues Cruise is on Saturday night. The idea is to entertain primarily and present some of the new artists that are out there. So I'm usually focusing on new records and new artists out on the blues scene. But the idea is to entertain and have a good time on Saturday night.
Okay, well, that's Saturday night. And of course, we talked about Into the Music, which is really Monday through Friday.
Yeah, right. Yep, Monday through Friday. So I play a lot of music. John, I've played a lot of music in my time.
Well, with that said, let's back up to some of those early years. What got you interested in music?
When I was a kid, I guess when I started listening to music was probably when we were living in New Orleans. And I think it was more than just music. It was, my mom used to bring these records home that she'd pick up at the grocery store. And it was a record that they'd issue one once a month, and it was the Adventurer series. It would be like, Adventurer goes with Columbus to discover America. And it lit up my imagination. And we, Adventurer, you're going with Paul Revere. And I love that stuff. And as time went on, my dad liked music a lot too. And as a youngster, my records like Marty Robbins' Gunfighter songs and Trail Ballads were coming out. And Johnny Horton had Sink the Bismarck, and all these story records were coming out. And people like Roger Miller, we just wore out Marty Robbins and Roger Miller and Homer and Jethro, these comedy records. I just would wear those things out. Well, then as time went on, I listened to the rock and much of the mainstream music that young high school boys listened to at that time. But I also started to get exposed to other music. And some of the things I point to, my dad's record collection, I have to say, was very influential for me. He was a great fan of guitar music. And when I was in my early days in high school, records like Merle Travis and Chet Atkins' Travelin' Show, that record came out. I love that record. And the Ken Burns series on country music just came out. And one of the things that they talk about was this record, Will the Circle Be Unbroken? Well, that record came out when I was like a sophomore in high school. And I had been listening to, Slade and Black Sabbath and Roar Rockin', but I didn't see that was going to last for me. I mean, there was something about it that I just thought, this is not what I'm going to listen to the rest of my life, But I fell in love with just the sparkling notes of Merle Travis's guitar, and I love those records. Well, Merle Travis and Jimmy Martin and all those great artists that appeared on that Will the Circle Be Unbroken record, Doc Watson, were on there. And that introduced me to a whole world of music there. And at that, so I have this whole acoustic kind of countryside that I started to really delve into. I mail-ordered records, and started to really get into Doc Watson in the early days. For me, I was always interested in the history of things. So I wanted to go back and start, like, where did this come from? Much like the Ken Burns series did with country music or with his series on jazz, I did that before that was how I just approached music. I like to learn it chronologically and go back, and so I spent a lot of time listening to records from the 20s and 30s. And about that time, there was a film that came out called Lady Sings the Blues, and Diana Ross played Billie Holiday. Well, I was very taken with the movie and the record that resulted from that, but I became intrigued by Billie Holiday herself, so I went and found Billie Holiday records, and I happened to get the Billie Holiday Decca recordings, which feature Lester Young and Benny Goodman and Teddy Wilson, and really was taken by that. Well, that, as my ear opened to that older music, then I was also taken by the music of Django Reinhardt and Stefan Grappelli and Louis Armstrong, who is still one of my, these are all my heroes, really. And Louis Armstrong's recordings of Fats Waller's music and W.C. Handy. And these things were all, I just really fell in love with this, And,
Well, so you gravitated away from sort of the popular music at the time and learned more, but so how do you pick music for your show now for people to listen to?
Well, my life really revolves around music. It really does. It's perfect. I love my job. I really do. I'm just a very lucky person that I've been able to spend my life doing something that I really love to do. And so I'm constantly reading and looking at charts. So I'll look at the the national AAA chart of what records have just been released, and I'll be aware of what's called Americana music, the country root side of things, and I'll know what records are charting, but I'll also know what records have been released, because people don't realize how much music comes into someplace like a public radio station. I probably take in 40 or 50 records a week. They're sent to us now digitally, and we get CDs, but we also get all this music sent to us. So there's just it's like opening the fire hydrant. There's a lot of music coming our way. Yeah. And so what I do is sift through it and find the things that I think will be most interesting and that catch my ear, and then I build my programs off of it.
Well, now you mentioned Louis Armstrong, but who are your favorite bands or singer-songwriters of all time?
Well, I'm asked this quite often, and I have to probably say Bob Dylan. It would be the top of the heap for me. And the reason is that Bob has put out so many records and has written so many great songs over the years that he just has to almost be in a category of his own. But for me, like, the greats are the greats. Like, whether it's Hank Williams or Billie Holiday or Louis Armstrong or Lester Young or, in the blues world, T-Bone Walker. And these people are great for a reason. I really, truly respect what they have done. When you spend every day doing this and you get to explore their catalogs, you really develop a sense of appreciation. Van Morrison has always been somebody that I really admire and love, and will always be aware of what he's doing.
Well, those are some from the past. How about now? How about current singer-songwriters?
Well, of course, these guys are still working. Bob is putting out very productive records. I like the recent records that I like. He came out a few years ago, a guy that worked with Van Morrison, actually, whose name was James Hunter. I really was knocked out by him. This past year, a guy that I've really been fired up about is a fellow named Charlie Crockett. Charlie Crockett was raised down in Texas and Louisiana, was a guy that sang on the streets for years down in New Orleans and in the subways in New York. And he plays country music and blues. I mean, his heroes are probably the same people my heroes are. Hank Williams is way up there. But he has his own style of doing it. And curiously enough, he has collaborated with Brennan Lee, who was raised in Fargo Moorhead and is now writing songs and actually appears on his records. So it's Charlie's somebody I like to draw attention to.
Yeah. What kind of feedback do you get from your listeners?
Pretty good feedback, actually. People really appreciate. I think it's the way. I mean, it's the way that I lay it out for them that they appreciate it. I think that the songs are, you know. What I want to do when I program and I drop a song in, I like to do it so they'll either smile or it'll move them in some way, so that we'll really try to appreciate each song.
You know, here's a question that comes up. You know, has every great melody basically been recorded, or is there an unlimited note combination?
You know, I hate to say, because computers. Who would think, you know, I mean, the internet, who would even think that the internet would have happened? But you know, I think there's still plenty of room for new songs and new ideas out there. And thankfully, artists are continually coming up with something new.
You know, you talked about your history. Seems like you mentioned New Orleans a few times, a lot of great music coming out of New Orleans. But what's the best concert or concerts that you've ever attended?
Well,
or wish you could attend, I guess, maybe.
No, I've been to some really good concerts. And, you know, my favorite night of live music was this guy named Fred Eaglesmith. We brought him into the studio. And he was just somebody, a name to me that was on a record. And that had been sent to me. I didn't know anything about him. And I listened to this record, and I thought it was his first record when I listened to it. And I thought, wow, this is a killer record. You know, all these songs are really good. And so I used to put out a list every year of 50 top extraordinary records of the year. And anyway, so I put that record on the list. Well, Fred happened to be coming up through, he'd been to the South by Southwest, and he was driving up to Canada, where he's from, and he passed through Grand Forks. And I received a call from Chris Lindgren, who ran the Westward Ho, and said, hey, this guy wants to know if he can do a show here. Should we do it? And I said, do it. And he put him into the Peanut Gallery, which was a very small room, held probably 40 people. And these guys were hilariously funny and had great songs and got 5 standing ovations from a packed room. It was a tremendous concert. I'll never forget it.
Well, Mike, I wish we had more time but when does your show air for people who'd like maybe to tune in, Monday through Friday?
Monday through Friday, 9 a.m., 9 Central to 10 a.m. I go on and I play for an hour, and then we bring the World Cafe for 2 hours, and then I return at noon and I play through the afternoon.
All right. And if people want more information, where can they go?
They just write me at my MOLSON at prairiepublic.org.
Mike, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you, John.
Stay tuned for more. Pieper Fleck Bloomquist is a Scandinavian folk artist from Grand Forks. Pieper has studied various styles of Swedish painting extensively. Keeping the tradition and history of these art forms alive is her passion.
My name is Pieper Fleck Bloomquist. I'm a Scandinavian folk artist, specializing in Swedish dalmålning, which is also called Kurbits painting, and Swedish bonadsmålning. Dalmålning. What is dalmålning? Målning is the Swedish word for painting. Just like rosmaling in Norwegian is rose painting. Måling or måler is Swedish word for paint or painting. Dolmålning is folk art from Sweden that refers to the very big wall paintings, like painted wallpaper, that was done in Dalarna, Sweden, specifically 1773 up until maybe the mid-1800s. Bonadsmålning describes the painting that was done roughly the same time period, although it started earlier and went on longer. It's a similar type of wall painting that was done in the southern part of Sweden, and the word bonad is tapestry. This was also a time in the 18th century and 19th century of the church having kind of a lot of presence in the lives of people. And this is how those two painting styles are similar. The painters, both in southern Sweden, bonadsmålers, and the dalmalers up in Dalarna, they had a Bible that had pictures of different stories, Old and New Testaments. They would use those pictures and paint those on the walls. So in northern Sweden, or the Dalarna painting, there was always this big Kurbits flower, and it is Swedish for gourd, and it first appeared in one of the Swedish language Bibles. In southern Sweden, the bonadsmålers, they used those same stories, but that big Kurbits flower is not present. They told them not in one giant picture, but almost like a comic strip, scene after scene after scene. And it could be either left to right or right to left, depending on where the head of house was going to be seated. I've dived quite heavily into the history of this particular art form in Sweden and how it evolved and why it's so unique to these two areas of Sweden. And here's another thing. Why am I interested in this? The chemistry of pigments and the history of pigment use is fascinating to me. And these artists had access to a lot of interesting pigments. A lot of them, they made their own paints. I can make my own paints. I know how. I'm much more comfortable using acrylic paint. When I paint, I try to be faithful to the way they did it originally sometimes, not all the time. I just can't go too far. There's a point where if you go too far, then suddenly you're not following this anymore. Then you're not part of this tradition anymore. One of my favorite paintings that I've done that I had in my mind for many years has been brewing in the back of my head, always there, how am I going to do this? I wanted to do a piece on my hometown, a very small town in Minnesota, population 44. A lot of the things that we did in that town are universal truths for other people who have lived in small towns in rural upper Midwest. One of the things that the bonadsmålers and the dalmalers both did was there was script across the top describing the story, and sometimes there was script in the painting itself. So if there was an activity happening down in one corner, the artist might put a couple of words above that activity describing it. And my dad owned one of the two bars, and one of the things he and many of the bar owners in our area had was this Ham's beer sign above the cash register that was moving. And all of us loved to watch that moving beer sign. It was mesmerizing as a child, and it's still mesmerizing to this day in my mind. So I had to include that little tiny picture of the Ham's beer sign above my dad's bar. But you wouldn't notice it if it weren't for the fact that I ended the script with, oh, how I wanted to live in that enchanted little tent. I'm not a production artist. That being said, if I've already gone through that process and have come up with something and sketched it, I can repeat that over and over and over again. That's what the old painters did. They had their pre-designed, preconceived ideas, here you go, farm wife, pick out which one you want. That one, got it, I'll work on that right now. And I don't know that there was a lot of thought process. For me, there is definitely, and my best work is work that I do for me. Because when I paint, honestly, it's coming from here. It's me having to come out.
Well, that's all we have on Prairie Pulse this week. And as always, thanks for watching.
Funded by the North Dakota Council on the Arts and by the members of Prairie Public.